In early 2024, a woman in London, England went out for what was supposed to be a casual date. The person she was meeting up with was someone she had known for years, but who she had sort of lost touch with until recently. She was excited to catch up and reconnect. But what the woman didn't know was that this other person had a completely different agenda for that night. For them, this evening had been in the works for some time, but not in the way that you would hope. What they were interested in wasn't dinner or drinks, but instead something out of a horrifying real-life nightmare. As always, my name is Nigel, and welcome back to Crime Zone. Just a heads up, I know today's video is on the shorter side, but I promise it's no less compelling. In fact, this might be one of the most unsettling and most unhinged stories we've covered on this channel. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. On April 2nd, 2024, a man from London, England named Ben Lyons was out for his usual morning walk with his dog. Ben lived in the borough of Croydon, which is located on the southern outskirts of the city, and that particular day he had taken his dog to a local park called Rowdown Field. As the name suggests, Rowdown Field is this big, open, grassy area with lots of space, so the perfect place to go and just let your dog run around. And this is exactly what Ben was doing that morning. When they got there around 9 a.m., he let his dog off the leash, and the animal sprinted off to go enjoy itself. Very quickly, though, Ben's dog became interested in this specific section of long grass and trees that lined the edge of the park. As we all know, dogs like to smell everything and check stuff out. But this was different. The dog was fixated on this one spot. Ben was finally able to call his dog back to him, but when it came running towards him, he could see that it now had something in its mouth. It turned out to be a bone. But not an ordinary animal bone. It was a human thigh bone, and unfortunately, this was only the beginning. After Ben alerted police to what he had found, officers from London's Metropolitan Police were immediately sent out to investigate. They would spend the next several days meticulously searching Rowdown Field and the surrounding area, during which time they made a number of other unsettling discoveries. In addition to the human thigh bone, police found the partially decomposed remains of a second leg, 2 arms, and a head. The body parts were scattered along a roughly 200-yard section of the park, with some being found hidden under a metal sheet. When they were taken away for analysis, it was clear that authorities were dealing with something incredibly serious and incredibly disturbing. The bones showed signs of clean marks where they were separated. This was deliberate, and whoever was responsible had used tools to make these cuts. It didn't take long for authorities to make another disturbing connection. You see, not only did all of these remains belong to the same person, they had been searching for a woman from this same general area for several weeks. Her name was Sarah Mayhew. Sarah was a 38-year-old woman who lived in a part of Croydon called New Addington. In fact, her home was only about a 2-mile drive from Rowdown Field. However, no one had seen her in almost a month. Sadly, very little is publicly available about Sarah. The few reports that do offer personal details about her mention that she didn't have an easy life. Still, what's also clear is that she was very loved. According to her parents, David and Angela, Sarah was a bubbly, chatty, funny person who was full of enthusiasm. Her mother described her as a popular girl with lots of friends, saying that it had been that way since she was a little girl. She loved her family and friends fiercely and was the type of person who would do anything to help the people that she loved, especially her 2 children, ages 12 and 15, who were more important to her than anything. When Sarah's friends and family stopped hearing from her in early March, they quickly sounded the alarm and notified police. Loved ones had looked for her and tried to contact her frantically, but there didn't seem to be a trace of her anywhere. They all hoped she would return home safely, but sadly, that wasn't the case. Very soon after the discovery in Rowdown Field, everyone's worst fears were confirmed. These were Sarah's remains, or at least her partial remains. Disturbingly, despite the thorough searches of the park, not all of Sarah's body could be located. That particular mystery was put on the back burner, though, as Metropolitan Police shifted their focus to digging further into Sarah's life, specifically into her last known whereabouts and movements prior to her disappearance. It wasn't long before they found something that caught their attention. While speaking to some of those close to her, investigators learned that before she went missing, Sarah had reconnected with an old romantic interest. This man's name was Stephen Sansom, a 44-year-old contractor who lived a few miles away in another borough of London called Sutton. Sarah and Stephen met a few years back randomly through a dating app. They had seen each other for a while and had been intimate before, but eventually the relationship fizzled out. The pair had remained friendly, though, and in fact, in the summer of 2023, Sarah had even introduced Stephen to another friend of hers named Gemma Watts. But their contact had been pretty infrequent since then, at least until recently. Sarah's cell phone records revealed that beginning sometime in January, Stephen suddenly started reaching out to her again. He had messaged her through Facebook and WhatsApp, and had also called her several times. At first, Sarah was slow to get back to Stephen, but she eventually responded. They began chatting regularly again, and Stephen started suggesting that they meet up. Again, initially, Sarah wasn't really in a rush to make any sort of plans, but Stephen was persistent, and over the next few weeks, he slowly won her over. A friend of Sarah's, named Paul Adams, said that he could tell there was still a lingering attraction there for her. During a phone call that he overheard between them, he said it sounded like Sarah was trying to impress Stephen. Based on the messages between them, it seemed that Sarah definitely had agreed to see him in the end. One exchange specifically stood out to police. It happened on March 1st when Stephen messaged Sarah, quote, "Fancy a little party." Stephen went on to explain that he had some drugs that they could do together and suggested that they get intimate. He texted, quote, "Please call. I'll wait until 10 p.m. to start my party. After that, we both miss out." Sarah eventually messaged back saying that she couldn't hang out that night, but she arranged to do something a week later on March 8th. When Stephen Sansom was asked about all of this, he denied having anything to do with Sarah's disappearance or death, but investigators didn't believe him. You see, March 8th wasn't just the day that Stephen and Sarah planned to hang out. It was also the last time anyone had heard from Sarah. That night, Sarah was captured on surveillance video at around 8:30 using an ATM. She messaged her dad through WhatsApp and hung out at a friend's place for a little while. When she left at around 11, she said she was heading to meet up with Stephen. Sure enough, when police checked CCTV footage near Stephen's place in Sutton, they saw the two of them entering his apartment together. Over the next few days, Stephen was captured on camera again numerous times, often in the company of a woman. The pair were seen all over the area walking Stephen's dog, taking public transit, and making trips to local stores. But here's the thing. That woman, it wasn't Sarah. Sarah was never seen again on camera after entering Stephen's apartment on March 8th. So, who was this mystery woman? It turned out that it was that friend of Sarah's I mentioned before, Gemma Watts. And when police started looking at the relationship between Gemma and Stephen, this whole case began to make sense. Not only would this connection explain everything that had happened, but it would also radically change the context of those seemingly mundane surveillance clips I just showed you. In order to fully understand all of this, though, first, we have to take a little detour. On December 24th, 1998, so more than 25 years before all of this, a 59-year-old cab driver named Terrence Boyle picked up a fare in East Croydon. Even though it was Christmas Eve and he really wanted to be with his family, Terrence was working late that night to make extra money to buy presents for his children. After collecting the male passenger who called for a ride, Terrence drove to the man's address. It seemed like just another normal fare. That was, until it came time to pay for the trip. That's when the man pulled out a knife and began stabbing and slashing him. The attack was extremely brutal, with Terrence suffering injuries all over his upper body. One of those wounds was a 5-inch long gash to his neck. When it was all over, the man stole Terrence's wallet and cut the cord to the microphone of his taxi radio so he couldn't call for help. He then ran off, leaving him to bleed out. Terrence managed to stumble to a nearby apartment where residents called emergency responders, but sadly, nothing could be done. He died a short time later. Well, the male passenger that Terrence had picked up that night was Stephen Sansom, then just 19 years old. Despite his young age, though, it should have been clear just how dangerous he was. Stephen was a genuine psychopath, and he felt no remorse whatsoever for what he had done. Immediately after the crime, he ran to a friend's house, still covered in Terrence's blood, laughing while he told them the details. At one point, he sickeningly joked, quote, "His kids are going to have to see him in hospital over Christmas." The horrific murder netted Stephen just 25 pounds in cash. When Stephen was convicted of the crime a year later, he was handed a life sentence. In actuality, though, he ended up serving just the minimum term attached to the sentence, which was 20 years. He was released in 2019 and was supposed to be on lifetime parole. But unfortunately, what no one in charge of supervising Stephen seemed to realize was that his bloodthirsty impulses had not dissipated one bit while behind bars. If anything, they had grown stronger. As we'll see, his head was full of unspeakable and nightmarish fantasies, and he had been given a second chance to carry them out. This is where things get especially devastating, because while it's unclear exactly how much Sarah Mayhew knew about Stephen's violent history, what she never could have predicted was that her own friend Gemma was just as dangerous. You see, it turned out that Stephen and Gemma were two sides of the same coin. And when Sarah introduced the two of them in the summer of 2023, she unwittingly set into motion something that would lead to her own horrifying death. When Stephen and Gemma met, they quickly recognized what the other was. Just like normal couples, they realized they had shared interests. Only instead of TV shows or outdoor activities or something like that, their fascinations included cannibalism, bestiality, and sadomasochism. Oh, and of course, anything to do with killing. The pair began a violent sexual relationship, and over the next few months started what can perhaps be best described as a rapid spiral into depravity. They enabled and egged on each other's sickest tendencies, reveling in just how twisted their deepest thoughts and desires were. This all became apparent when police got a look at Stephen and Gemma's text messages. They saw how the relationship rapidly evolved from one based around S&M to something far more sinister. In early September of 2023, Gemma sent a note to Stephen that read in part, quote, "I am writing this of my own free will. Should any serious injury or even death occur whilst I am with Stephen Sansom, let it be made fully understood that I enter the act of violent, dangerous sex games with Stephen Sansom of my own free will." This quickly escalated to the pair discussing murder. In revolting messages, they talked about getting intimate with each other while covered in someone else's blood, and how they could, quote, "feast and kill their way round the country." In one particularly jarring exchange, Stephen said, quote, "Everything looks like meat now, don't they? A plaything, something to cut, something to bleed. They all look different now." Gemma replied, quote, "Wonder what they taste like, cooked flesh, maybe even rare, so blood drips down our faces." Stephen then said, quote, "People taste like pork. Consistency, textures the same." While Stephen and Gemma mutually enjoyed their wannabe serial killer safe space, the messages made it clear that within a short time they were growing bored. They wanted to act out the things they were discussing and began talking about bringing in a third party. In other words, a victim. By November, they had decided that person would be Sarah Mayhew. I should make it clear that even though Stephen was the dominant one in the relationship, so to speak, Gemma was by no means less involved in any of this. In fact, the messages between them revealed that she had been pivotal in pushing for Sarah to be the person they killed. She claimed Sarah owed her money and that she had pissed her off big time. She also stated that she wanted to stab a skank. So in January of 2024, when Stephen began reaching out to Sarah again, It wasn't because he was interested in reconnecting or rekindling some type of romance. It was all part of a plot to lure Sarah to his apartment so that he and Gemma could live out their fantasies. On March 8th, they had been successful. While it's unclear exactly what happened in Stephen's apartment that fateful night, what we do know is that when he and Sarah came in, Gemma was already waiting. Sarah had unknowingly walked into their trap, and chillingly, there was no escape. Because of the state of Sarah's remains when they were finally found, investigators were unable to determine a lot of specifics in terms of what had happened to her. There were signs of trauma to her head, though, as well as to her voice box, so it's possible she was beaten and strangled. What's perhaps most disturbing, though, is there's no telling how long this actually went on. Medical examiners estimated that Sarah had likely died sometime between March 8th and 9th, but they couldn't be sure. What they did say, though, is that her death likely didn't occur right away. This was further backed by the fact that when her head was found, her hair had been shaved off. Whatever unspeakable horrors occurred, though, they seemingly had no impact whatsoever on Stephen and Gemma. The couple were described by neighbors as chatty and upbeat over the following days. Thanks to meticulous searches through CCTV footage, authorities were able to retrace the pair's steps. This is what I alluded to before about the context of those surveillance clips. On March 10th, Stephen was captured on video at a B&Q hardware store. During that visit, he purchased a 300mm hacksaw with a replacement blade, as well as a 14-liter bucket. These were among the tools used to cut up Sarah's body. The following day, Stephen and Gemma were caught on CCTV cameras a number of times, during which it's believed they were disposing of Sarah's remains. In the morning, they can be seen on public transit with large bags, which they appear to be struggling to carry. That same afternoon, they were spotted walking off in the background of footage taken of Rodown Field. Hours later, the pair were recorded coming and going multiple times from Stephen's apartment. In one of these clips, they were captured wheeling a large rolling suitcase down the road. It was this footage that actually helped police to finally recover the last of Sarah's remains on May 21st. Her torso was found in the River Wandle, in an area called Mitcham, a few miles northwest of Croydon. This was by no means the last of the footage police were able to put together as evidence, though. For example, on March 12th, Gemma was recorded by CCTV cameras at a store buying a large amount of cleaning supplies, as well as a metal incinerator. Small bits of video surveillance like this helped to fill in the last remaining details investigators were missing. They showed the elaborate steps Stephen and Gemma had taken to try and cover up the crime. Despite their extensive cleaning efforts, though, blood evidence was still found in multiple rooms of Stephen's apartment. The only things authorities weren't able to recover were Sarah's personal items, though it was speculated that these had been disposed of using that incinerator. Both Stephen and Gemma confessed to the crime following their arrests, but neither showed any remorse. If anything, the pair doubled down and seemed to relish in what they had done. During a police interview, Gemma told detectives that Sarah deserved what had happened to her, calling her a dirty crackhead. And Stephen had the audacity to insist in messages, quote, "We are not evil. We done the world a service." None of this changed when the case went to court. While Stephen and Gemma both pleaded guilty, their behavior during the proceedings showed just how little regard they had for Sarah or her loved ones. While in the courtroom, Gemma had to be admonished several times for laughing, giggling, and winking at Stephen. In a note she sent to him while in custody, she wrote in part, quote, "Love lasts, my evil twin." Because of the aggravating circumstances and extremely serious nature of the crime, Stephen and Gemma were both handed life sentences in January of 2025. Given what happened with Stephen before, you're probably skeptical of exactly what that means, which is fair. Indeed, Gemma was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years, meaning she could one day be let out of prison. However, Stephen was given what's known in the UK as a whole life order. This is a true life sentence, meaning that he will never be eligible for parole again. Of course, when the public learned about the horrifying details of the case and Stephen's prior criminal history, there was a lot of outrage. Many understandably felt that none of this would have happened if the justice system hadn't released a so obviously dangerous person like Stephen back out into the community and allowed him the opportunity to kill again. To that end, the case did prompt a review to be launched into the circumstances of Stephen's release and the supervision he was under during his parole. At the time of this recording, that review still has yet to be completed. There are a lot of reasons to be angry about this case, but in my opinion, one of the biggest tragedies goes back to what I said before about Sarah herself and the fact that so little is actually available about her online. It's always heartbreaking when we look into cases like this, and it feels like there's so much more out there about a person's death than their life. I can only hope that the conviction and sentencing of Sarah's killers has brought some semblance of peace and closure to her family.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, everyone, and take care.